We all remember that moment when someone saw something special in us that no one else could see. Sometimes it takes just one person believing in us to change everything. Under the golden sunset at a prairie trading post, an Apache man named Nakai walked up to the wooden porch. Traders in dusty clothes stood around laughing and talking. On the table sat a young wolf, calm and watching. The men had caught it days before. "Pick any dog you like," one trader said with a big smile. He pointed to some dogs tied up nearby, but Nakai pointed to the wolf on the table. The laughter stopped. This wasn't about breaking the wolf or making it obey. It was about trust. For 20 years, the wolf stayed with Nakai. But what made their friendship so strong? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather pouch hanging at Nakai's side had seen more sunrises than most men count in a lifetime. Worn smooth by decades of handling, it contained the sacred remnants of his people's wisdom, a piece of turquoise from his grandmother's necklace, dried sage from the sacred mountains, and a small arrowhead carved by his father's father. Today, as he approached the weathered trading post that squatted like a tired animal against the endless prairie, the pouch felt heavier than usual. The year was 1887, and the world was changing faster than an old man could walk. Nakai had seen 43 summers, though his face carried the weight of watching his people's ancient ways slowly fade into memory. The Apache lands were shrinking like a hide left too long in the sun, and each trading post, each new settlement, marked another step away from the old life. But Nakai had learned something that many of his brothers had not. Sometimes survival meant walking between two worlds rather than fighting them both. He spoke English as well as any schoolmaster, having learned it during his years as a scout for the army, years he rarely discussed, but never regretted. Those experiences had taught him that understanding your enemy often proved more valuable than defeating him. The trading post sprawled before him like a small wooden town, 3 buildings connected by covered walkways, with corrals stretching out behind where horses and cattle waited for buyers. The main building's porch ran the full length of the structure, shaded by a roof that had seen better years. Wooden barrels and crates lined the walls, and the air carried the mingled scents of leather, tobacco, coffee, and something else. Something wild and afraid. As Nakai climbed the 3 steps to the porch, his moccasins made no sound on the worn planks. The trading post served as neutral ground, where Apache, Mexican, and American interests occasionally found common cause. Old Willem Morrison, the proprietor, had built his business on fairness, a rare commodity in those days. He treated Apache customers with the same respect he showed wealthy ranchers, which explained why his post prospered while others struggled. "Nakai!" Willem's voice boomed from inside the store. The big Dutchman emerged, wiping his hands on a leather apron, his weathered face creasing into a genuine smile. "Been wondering when you'd show up. Got that rifle you ordered from back east." "Hello, old friend." Nakai's English carried only the slightest accent, each word chosen with care. "The rifle can wait. I heard you have something unusual." Willem's expression grew curious. "Word travels fast out here. You mean the wolf?" Before Nakai could answer, laughter erupted from the far end of the porch, where 4 men sat around a rough wooden table. Cards lay scattered across its surface, along with a half-empty bottle of whiskey and various trading goods. These were the regular crowd, men who made their living buying and selling whatever could turn a profit. Jake Morrison, Willem's younger brother, slapped his cards down with excessive force. $20 says nobody can make that animal do anything useful," he declared, his voice already thick with drink despite the early hour. Wild as the day it was born, his companion, a lean man named Garrett who dealt in livestock, chuckled and spat tobacco juice over the porch rail. "Thing's got no more sense than a rattlesnake. Pretty to look at, maybe, but useless as teats on a boar hog." The third man, a Mexican trader called Esteban, shook his head slowly. He'd been dealing in this country longer than any of them and had developed a healthy respect for things that survived in the wild. "You Norte Americanos," he said with mild disgust. "You think everything must serve you or be destroyed. Perhaps this animal has its own purpose." The fourth member of their group, a young settler named Tom, who'd arrived from Ohio the previous spring, leaned forward eagerly. "My pa always said a good dog should heel, sit, and come when called. This one just stares at you like it knows something." "You don't." Nakai approached the table slowly, his eyes taking in the scene. The wolf sat on the table's far end, as calm and composed as a dinner guest waiting for the meal to begin. It was perhaps 4 months old, already showing the long legs and broad paws that promised considerable size. Its coat mixed grey and brown with lighter patches around the face and chest. But what struck Nakai most were the eyes, amber gold and completely unafraid. Most young animals showed some sign of distress when caged or captured. They paced, whined, or cowered. This wolf did none of those things. It sat with perfect posture, occasionally turning its head to study the men around it, but showing no inclination to flee or attack. There was an intelligence in those eyes that made Nakai's chest tighten with recognition. "Where did you find him?" Nakai asked. Jake looked up, surprised by the question. "Garrett found the whole litter after their mama got herself shot." "Fool. Animal was raiding Johnson's chickens. We managed to catch this one before it could follow its siblings into the brush. The others escaped." "Smart enough to run," Garrett said with grudging respect. "This one just sat there watching us like we were the ones in a cage." Nakai studied the wolf more carefully. The animal's gaze shifted to meet his, and for a moment man and wolf regarded each other with mutual assessment. There was no fear in the young creature's eyes, but something else, a quality Nakai recognized from his own reflection during the hardest years of his life. The wolf was waiting. "What do you plan to do with him?" Nakai asked. "Sell him to whoever wants an unusual." "Bet," Jake replied. "Figure somebody back east might pay good money for a tame wolf." "Tame?" Esteban snorted. "Look at those eyes, my friend. That animal will never be tame." "Then we'll find someone who likes them wild," Jake said with a shrug. "Either way, he's worth something to somebody." Tom laughed and gestured toward the other animals. "Hell, take any dog you like, but I wouldn't waste money on that one. Dogs are supposed to be useful. That thing's just pretty." Nakai felt the familiar weight of his medicine pouch against his hip. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory, speaking words she'd shared when he was younger than the wolf before him. "The spirits sometimes send teachers who don't look like teachers. The wise man learns to recognize the lesson." The wolf turned, its head again, this time fixing its gaze directly on Nakai. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, almost imperceptibly, the wolf's ear twitched, not in alarm, but in what might have been acknowledgement. "How much?" Nakai asked quietly. "Bishti." Laughter around the table died as the men realized he was serious. The weathered ledger book lay open beside Jake Morrison's elbow, its pages yellow with age and stained with coffee rings. Each entry recorded in Willem's careful handwriting told the story of the frontier economy. 3 horses traded for winter. Supplies, a wagon load of furs exchanged for ammunition, 2 milk cows bartered for seed corn. Everything had a price. Everything had a value that could be written down and calculated. But as Nakai's words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, the ledger seemed suddenly inadequate for what was about to unfold. Jake Morrison's whiskey-glazed eyes widened as he processed what he'd heard. "You're serious? You want to buy the wolf?" "I am serious," Nakai replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded Apache warriors and later earned respect among army officers. "How much?" Garrett leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. "Now hold." "On there, Nakai. That's not exactly a normal purchase. Thing could turn on you without warning. Wolves ain't like dogs. They got no loyalty to humans." Perhaps loyalty must be earned rather than demanded, Nakai said, never taking his eyes off the wolf. The animal had remained perfectly still throughout their conversation, but now it shifted slightly, turning its body to face Nakai more directly. The movement was subtle, but every man at the table noticed it. Tom scratched his head, still trying to understand. But what would you do with it? Can't exactly put it to work herding sheep. Not everything valuable must work for its keep, Nakai replied. Sometimes the greatest value lies in what something teaches us about ourselves. Esteban nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his dark eyes. In my country, we have stories of such partnerships. The old people say some bonds exist beyond human understanding. Jake looked around the table, calculating quickly. The wolf had cost them nothing except the trouble of catching it, and any price would be pure profit. But something in Nakai's demeanor made him hesitant to name a figure too quickly. Well, Jake said, trying to sound casual, seeing as how it's you asking, Nakai, and you've always dealt fair with us, $20. The price was steep enough to discourage impulse buyers, but not so high as to be insulting. Jake expected Nakai to negotiate, to point out that an untrained wolf couldn't possibly be worth as much as a good horse. Instead, Nakai reached into his leather vest and withdrew a small cloth pouch. He counted out 20 silver dollars and placed them on the table with deliberate care, each coin making a soft metallic sound as it settled on the wood. Done, he said simply. The men stared at the money, then at Nakai, then at the wolf. The transaction felt significant in a way none of them could quite explain, as if they'd just witnessed something that would be remembered long after the silver was spent. Well, I'll be damned, Garrett muttered. Easiest $20 I ever saw made. But Willem, who had emerged from the store to watch the proceedings, frowned deeply. Nakai, you sure about this? That animal's wild. Could be dangerous. Wild things are dangerous, Nakai agreed, but danger and evil are not the same thing. This one is not evil. He approached the table slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The wolf watched him come without tension, without fear. When Nakai was close enough to reach out and touch the animal, he stopped and simply stood there. What now? Tom asked. You going to put a rope on it? No rope, Nakai said quietly. We will see what happens. For a long moment, man and wolf regarded each other. The trading post fell unusually quiet. Even the horses in the distant corrals seemed to sense that something important was taking place. The only sounds were the whisper of wind through the prairie grass and the distant call of a hawk hunting in the afternoon sky. Then, moving with careful deliberation, Nakai extended his hand palm down toward the wolf, not reaching to grab or control, but offering. The gesture was an invitation rather than a command. The wolf studied his hand for several heartbeats. Then, equally deliberate, it leaned forward and sniffed his fingers. Nakai remained perfectly still as the animal investigated his scent, learning something about this human that coins and words couldn't convey. Satisfied with its examination, the wolf sat back, but didn't retreat. Instead, it tilted its head slightly to one side, a gesture that seemed almost inquisitive. I'll be hanged, Jake breathed. Thing acts like it knows you. Perhaps, Nakai said softly. We knew each other before this moment. Tom laughed nervously. What's that supposed to mean? But Esteban understood, nodding gravely. Some meetings are not meetings at all, but recognitions. Nakai took another small step closer. The wolf remained calm, watching his approach with those remarkable amber eyes. When he was close enough, Nakai slowly sat down on the porch, bringing himself to the wolf's eye level. What are you doing? Garrett asked, alarm creeping into his voice. If that thing decides to bite, it will not bite, Nakai said with quiet certainty. Look at its ears, its tail, the way it holds its body. This is not an animal preparing for attack. This is an animal making a choice. Indeed, the wolf showed none of the signs of aggression the men had learned to recognize in ranch dogs and barn cats. Its ears pointed forward with interest rather than flattened in warning. Its tail remained still rather than bristled. Most tellingly, it had not bared its teeth or growled once since Nakai's approach began. Slowly, Nakai reached out, again, this time placing his palm gently on the wooden table beside the wolf. He didn't try to touch the animal, but simply offered his presence. The wolf considered this for a moment, then did something that made every man on the porch catch his breath. It stepped forward and placed one paw on Nakai's hand. The contact lasted only a few seconds, but in that brief touch, something passed between man and animal that words couldn't capture. It wasn't submission or dominance, but something else entirely, a recognition of equals, a tentative agreement to trust. When the wolf stepped back, Nakai rose slowly to his feet. "We should go," he said, speaking to the animal as if it could understand every word. "There is much to learn about each other." To everyone's amazement, the wolf stood as well. Without any leash or encouragement, it walked to the edge of the table and began to climb down, using the support posts and crossbeams with the fluid grace of a creature born to navigate difficult terrain. Once on the porch, it moved to Nakai's side and sat down, not pressed against him like a frightened pet, but close enough to indicate choice rather than coincidence. "Well, I'll be damned," Willem said quietly. 20 years in this business and I've never seen anything like that." Jake gathered up the silver coins with hands that trembled slightly. "Money's yours, Nakai. Can't say I understand what just happened, but a deal's a deal." Nakai nodded his, "And thanks," then looked down at the wolf. "Shall we go home?" he asked. The wolf's tail moved once, not a frantic wag, but a single deliberate sweep that might have been agreement. Together they walked down the porch steps and into the golden afternoon light, leaving behind 4 men who would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain what they had witnessed. The wooden bowl had been carved from a single piece of oak by Nakai's grandfather, its surface worn smooth by generations of use. Simple in design but perfect in proportion, it had fed Apache warriors before the white man came to these lands. And now it sat between Nakai and the wolf on the packed earth floor of his small cabin. 3 days had passed since their meeting at the trading post, and each sunrise had brought new understanding between man and animal. Nakai had named his companion Shyla, brother in his mother's tongue, though he suspected the wolf had always carried its own name in the silence of its heart. The cabin stood in a grove of cottonwoods beside a creek that never ran dry, even in the harshest summers. Nakai had built it with his own hands 5 years earlier, when he'd decided that walking between 2 worlds required a place that belonged fully to neither. The structure was solid but modest. 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and windows that faced all 4 directions, so nothing could approach unseen. This morning, like those before it, began with patience. Nakai filled the wooden bowl with water from the creek and placed it between himself and Shyla. The wolf watched these movements with careful attention, but made no move toward the water. They had established this ritual on their first morning together, not because Shyla was thirsty, for the creek ran just beyond the cabin door, but because sharing was the foundation of trust. "Water is life," Nakai spoke quietly, though he wasn't sure why. He felt compelled to explain. "Among my people, to share water is to say, 'I will not let you thirst.'" Shyla's amber eyes followed every word, though the wolf remained motionless. This was their pattern. Nakai would speak, and Shyla would listen with an attention that seemed almost human in its intensity. For several minutes, neither moved. Then, as he had each previous morning, Nakai dipped his fingers in the water and brought them to his lips. The gesture was deliberate, theatrical almost, designed to show that the water was safe and freely offered. On the first morning, Shyla had watched this ritual but kept his distance. On the second morning, he had approached the bowl after Nakai, moved away, drinking quickly before retreating. But this morning something changed. Shyla rose from his resting place and walked to the bowl, but instead of drinking immediately, he sat down across from Nakai. For a long moment, they regarded each other over the wooden rim, Then Shyla lowered his head and drank, never taking his eyes off the man who had chosen him. "Good," Nakai said softly. "We begin to understand each other." The morning's lessons continued outside, where Nakai tended his small garden, and Shyla explored the boundaries of their shared territory. The wolf moved with purpose, investigating every tree, rock, and patch of earth within 100 yards of the cabin. He was mapping their world, learning its scents and secrets. Nakai watched this exploration with growing respect. Shyla wasn't running wild or testing limits. He was conducting a thorough reconnaissance that would have impressed any Apache scout. The wolf understood that survival depended on knowing every detail of his environment. "You have been taught." "Well," Nakai observed as Shyla completed his circuit and returned to the cabin. "Your mother was wise." At the mention of his mother, Shyla's ears pricked forward. Did he remember? Did wolves carry such memories? Nakai suspected they did, just as Apache children carried the wisdom of their grandmothers in their blood. The afternoon brought their first visitors. Maria Santos had lived in the valley longer than anyone except the Apache themselves. Her husband had been a Mexican soldier who decided he preferred farming to fighting, and together they'd built a small ranch that somehow managed to thrive despite raids, droughts, and the general chaos of frontier life. Maria was practical, tough, and completely unimpressed by things that existed merely to look dangerous. She rode up to the cabin on her old mare, a basket of fresh tortillas balanced on her saddle horn. But when she saw Shyla lying in the shade beside Nakai's door, she pulled her horse to a sudden stop. "Dios mío," she breathed. "Nakai, what have you done?" "I have gained a brother," Nakai replied, rising from where he'd been repairing a bridle. "Maria Santos, meet Shyla." The wolf had risen as well, but showed no signs of alarm. He studied the woman and her horse with calm interest, as if visitors were a normal part of his day. Maria remained mounted, her weathered hands tight on the reins. "That is not a dog, my friend." "No," Nakai agreed. "He is not a dog. Wolves kill cattle, they kill sheep, they kill anything that cannot defend itself." "Some wolves do these things," Nakai acknowledged. "Some men do these things as well." "Does this mean all men are killers?" Maria considered this, her dark eyes moving between Nakai and Shyla. She had known Nakai for 3 years and trusted his judgment in most matters. But this seemed to push the boundaries of reasonable trust. "How? Do you know he will not turn on you?" she asked finally. "How does anyone know such things about any creature?" Nakai replied. "I know because I choose to trust and because he chooses to stay." As if to demonstrate this point, Shyla rose and walked to Nakai's side. He didn't press against him or seek comfort, but simply positioned himself where he could watch both the woman and the approaches to their territory. "He protects you," Maria observed with surprise. "We protect each other," Nakai corrected. "This is how partnerships work." Maria dismounted slowly, keeping her movements deliberate and non-threatening. Shyla watched, but didn't retreat. When she approached with the basket of tortillas, he sniffed the air, cataloguing the scents of flour, lard, and wood smoke that clung to her clothes. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the wolf. "Ask him," Nakai replied. "His permission is not mine to give." Maria looked directly at Shyla, her expression serious. "Hola, hermano Lobo. I am a friend of your friend." The wolf tilted his head, slightly, as if considering her words. Then, to everyone's surprise, he approached Maria and sniffed her outstretched hand. After a moment, apparently satisfied with his investigation, he stepped back and sat down. "Incredible," Maria whispered. "He understands more than most people realize," Nakai agreed. That evening, as Maria prepared to leave, she paused beside her horse. "The people in town, they will not understand this. I know. They will say you are loco, keeping a wolf like a pet." "He is not a pet," Nakai said firmly. "He is a partner who chooses to share his life with mine. There is a difference." Maria nodded slowly. "See, there is a difference. But will they see it?" Nakai looked at Shyla, who was watching the sunset from his favorite spot beside the cabin door. Some will, others will only see what they expect to see. And if they cause trouble, then we will deal with trouble when it comes, Nakai replied. But we will not live in fear of what might happen. As Maria rode away, Shyla moved to Nakai's side. Together they watched the last light fade from the western sky, two creatures who had found something in each other that the world seemed determined to say was impossible. In the growing darkness, Shyla's shoulder brushed against Nakai's. Leg just once, just briefly, but enough to say what words could not capture. They were no longer alone. The Apache blanket had traveled more miles than most men would walk in 10 lifetimes. Woven by Nakai's grandmother during the long winters before the reservations, its patterns told stories of hunts and victories, of seasons when the people prospered and times when they endured. The deep reds and browns had faded to softer hues, and the wool had grown thin in places, but the blanket remained strong enough to ward off the mountain cold. Now, 6 weeks after that pivotal day at the trading post, it lay spread beneath the stars, with two forms silhouetted against its weathered surface. Nakai had not planned to share the blanket. During his years as a scout and his solitary life in the cabin, he had grown accustomed to the simple ritual of sleeping alone, wrapped in the memories his grandmother had woven into the fabric. But Shyla had made his own decision about sleeping. Arrangements. It began during the first cold snap of early autumn. Nakai had built up the fire before retiring and settled onto his usual sleeping spot near the hearth. Shyla, who typically rested by the door where he could monitor both the interior and exterior of the cabin, had remained restless throughout. At the evening, instead of settling in his chosen spot, the wolf had approached Nakai's bedroll with careful steps. He'd sat down just beyond the edge of the blanket and waited, amber eyes reflecting the firelight. "What troubles you, brother?" Nakai had asked softly. Shyla's answer came not in words but in action. He'd lain down with his back pressed against the outside edge of the blanket, close enough to share warmth, but not so close as to presume invitation. The message was clear. Protection was easier when protector and protected remained within reach of each other. Now, weeks later, their nighttime arrangement had evolved into something neither had planned, but both had accepted. The blanket was large enough for two, and the mountain nights were cold enough to make shared warmth practical. More importantly, Nakai had discovered that having Shyla nearby brought a quality of sleep he hadn't experienced since childhood. The deep rest that comes only when someone you trust completely is watching over your dreams. This particular morning, it brought unexpected visitors. Nakai woke to Shyla's soft growl, a sound pitched low enough not to wake a sleeping man, but distinct enough to alert one already stirring. The wolf had risen from the blanket and moved to the cabin's main window, his body tense with attention. "How many?" Nakai whispered, reaching for the rifle that leaned against the wall beside his bed. Shyla's ears swiveled toward the sound of his voice, then back toward whatever had caught his attention. 2 quick flicks of his tail, a signal they'd developed to indicate the number of approaching riders. Nakai rose silently and moved to the window beside Shyla. Through the morning mist, he could see 2 horsemen approaching along the creek trail. Their posture and pace suggested business rather than threats, but in this country, business could turn dangerous without warning. "Easy, brother," he murmured, resting his hand briefly on Shyla's shoulder. "Let's see what they want." The riders proved to be Tom Henderson, the young settler from the trading post, and an older man Nakai didn't recognize. They approached the cabin with the careful manner of men who weren't entirely sure of their welcome, especially given the stories that had begun circulating about Nakai's unusual companion. "Hello, the cabin," Tom called out when they were still, 50 yards away. "Got someone here who'd like to meet your wolf?" Nakai stepped onto his small porch, Shyla moving to stand beside him. The wolf's demeanor was alert, but not aggressive. Curious about the strangers, but confident in his ability to handle whatever they might represent. The older man turned out to be Professor Edmund Hartwell from the Territorial University, a thin gentleman with wire spectacles and an obvious fascination with natural history. He dismounted with the awkward movements of someone more comfortable with books than horses, his eyes fixed on Shyla with barely contained excitement. "Remarkable," he breathed, pulling a leather journal from his saddlebag. "Simply remarkable. Mr. Henderson told me about your arrangement with this animal, but I confess I was skeptical. May I observe him more closely?" "You may ask him," Nakai replied, "but the choice is his to make." Professor Hartwell blinked behind his spectacles. "Ask him. But surely, I mean, it's an animal." "All creatures are animals," Nakai pointed out, "including us. This one simply chooses to live by different rules than most." Tom shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Professor's been asking about your wolf all over the territory. Heard about it from some army folks who know you from your scouting days." The mention of the army caused Nakai's expression to tighten slightly, but he nodded. "What do you wish to know, Professor?" "Everything," Hartwell exclaimed, then caught himself and adopted a more scholarly tone. "That is, I'm conducting research on the behavioral differences between domesticated canines and their wild counterparts. The opportunity to observe a wolf living peacefully with humans represents an unprecedented chance to—" "Professor," Nakai interrupted gently, "why don't you sit down and observe? But remember, you are a guest in his territory as much as mine." They settled on the porch, where Nakai served coffee and watched Hartwell attempt to apply scientific methodology to something that defied academic categories. The professor made detailed notes about Shyla's posture, movements, and responses to various stimuli, but Nakai could see that the man was struggling to fit what he observed into his existing frameworks. "The socialization patterns are completely inconsistent with accepted theories," Hartwell muttered, scribbling furiously. "No submissive behaviors, no pack hierarchy establishment, yet clear evidence of voluntary cooperation. Perhaps," Nakai suggested, "your theories are incomplete." Shyla, meanwhile, had conducted his own assessment of the visitors. After determining that neither man represented a threat, he'd settled into a position where he could monitor the entire clearing while appearing relaxed. When Professor Hartwell dropped his pencil, Shyla calmly retrieved it and placed it within the man's reach, a gesture that left the academic speechless. How did he know?" Hartwell stammered. "He pays attention," Nakai replied. "Simply. Most creatures do when they're not distracted by thinking about how smart they are." Tom laughed despite himself. "Professor, I think you just got schooled by a wolf." As the morning wore on, something unexpected began to happen. Professor Hartwell's rigid academic approach gradually gave way to simple wonder. He found himself talking to Shyla as if the wolf could understand every word, and remarkably, Shyla seemed to respond with attention and what might have been interest. "This challenges everything we think we know about animal cognition," Hartwell admitted finally. "He's not just intelligent, he's thoughtful, contemplative even." "Intelligence takes many forms," Nakai observed. "Your books teach you to think. One way, the land teaches different lessons." When the visitors prepared to leave, Professor Hartwell approached Nakai with obvious reluctance. "Would you consider, that is, the university would be very interested in studying this relationship more formally? There could be compensation, recognition." "No," Nakai said firmly. "Shyla is not a specimen to be studied. He is a being who has chosen to share his life with mine. That trust is not for sale." Hartwell nodded, disappointed but not entirely surprised. "I understand. But if you ever change your mind—" "I will not change my mind about this," Nakai replied. As the two men rode away, Tom called back over his shoulder, "People are starting to talk, Nakai. Might want to keep that in mind." Nakai watched them disappear along the creek trail, then looked down at Shyla. "What do you think, brother? Should we worry about what people say?" Shyla's response was to move closer and rest his head briefly against Nakai's leg, a gesture That had become his way of saying that some bonds mattered more than the opinions of strangers. That evening, as they settled onto their shared blanket, Nakai reflected on how much had changed since that day at the trading post. Sheila was no longer the uncertain young wolf trying to understand his place in a human world. He had grown confident in their partnership, protective without being possessive, loyal without surrendering his essential wildness. But Tom's warning echoed in Nakai's mind. People were talking. In his experience, when people talked long enough about things they didn't understand, talk eventually turned to action. And when people acted out of fear or ignorance, the results were rarely peaceful. Beside him, Sheila shifted slightly, pressing closer as the night air grew cold. In sleep, the wolf's defenses relaxed, and Nakai could see traces of the young creature who had sat so calmly on that trading post table, waiting for someone to recognize his worth. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The blanket that had once wrapped a solitary man now sheltered a partnership that was becoming stronger with each passing day. The silver bracelet had come from Sarah Whitmore's grandmother, passed down through 3 generations of frontier women who understood that survival often depended on the kindness of neighbors. When Sarah offered it to Nakai after he'd helped deliver her difficult birth during a winter storm, he'd initially refused. But she'd insisted, pressing the tarnished silver into his palm with tears in her eyes. "You saved both our lives," she'd said simply. "This is the only way I know to say what that means." Now, 2 years after that snowy February night, the bracelet caught the afternoon sunlight as Nakai worked alongside a crew of men building a new irrigation ditch. The project represented something unprecedented in the valley, Apache knowledge combined with settler determination to create something that would benefit everyone. Sheila, now fully grown and magnificent in his prime, rested in the shade of a cottonwood where he could observe the work and monitor the surrounding countryside. His presence had become so familiar that the workers barely noticed him anymore, though visitors still stopped and stared at the sight of a full-grown wolf lying peacefully among domestic animals and human activity. "Hand me that shovel, Wood." "You, Nakai?" called out James Patterson, a rancher whose initial suspicion of both Nakai and his companion had gradually transformed into genuine respect. "This clay's tougher than old boot leather." Nakai passed the tool and returned to his own section of the ditch, where his understanding of water flow and seasonal patterns had proved invaluable. The Apache had survived in this harsh country for generations by learning to work with the land rather than against it, and those lessons were now helping their new neighbors prosper. "You know," said Carl Brennan, wiping sweat from his forehead, "my grandfather would roll over in his grave if he knew I was taking irrigation advice from an Indian." He paused, then added with a rueful smile, "Course, my grandfather never had to make corn grow in country like this." The work continued through the hot afternoon, with Nakai serving as both laborer and consultant. His suggestions about grade and drainage drew on centuries of Apache wisdom, while his patient explanations helped the settlers understand principles they'd never encountered in their previous homes. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, a lone rider approached from the direction of town. Willem Morrison dismounted and walked over to where the crew was packing up their tools for the day. "Nakai," he said, his weathered face serious. "Got a minute? Need to talk to you about something." They walked apart from the others, Sheila rising to follow, with the silent grace that never failed to impress those who understood the rarity of such trust between species. "What troubles you, old friend?" Nakai asked. Willem glanced around too, ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "Been hearing talk in town, some of the newer settlers, ones who don't know you like we do. They're saying things." "What kind of things?" "The usual ignorant nonsense. That keeping a wolf is unnatural. That it's only a matter of time before he turns dangerous. You know how people can be when they're afraid of what they don't understand." Nakai nodded calmly. "And what do you tell them?" "The truth, that I've known you for 5 years and seen how you and Shyla work together, that he's never shown aggression to anyone who didn't deserve it, that you've helped more people in this valley than any preacher or politician. But they don't listen, Willem sighed. Some do. But there's a group forming calling themselves the Settlers Protection Committee. They're led by a man named Marcus Reed who came down from Colorado last month. He's been stirring up fears about Indian raids and dangerous animals. Nakai's expression remained unchanged, but those who knew him well would have recognized the subtle tension that entered his shoulders. And what does this committee propose to do about their fears? Nothing yet. But Reed's been asking questions. About you, about where you live, about your wolf. Claims he's concerned about public safety. Shyla had positioned himself where he could see both men's faces while watching the approaches to their location. Though he couldn't understand the words, something in their tone had put him on alert. Thank you for the warning, Nakai said. I will be careful. Maybe you should consider, Willem began, then stopped himself. Consider what? Nothing. Forget I said anything. But Nakai pressed him. You were going to suggest I send Shyla away. Willem's silence was answer enough. My friend, Nakai said gently, I understand your concern, but Shyla and I are partners. Asking me to abandon him would be like asking you to abandon your brother. It's not the same thing, Nakai. Your brother's a wolf. Yes, Nakai agreed. And that makes our bond more remarkable, not less meaningful. They parted with mutual respect, but underlying worry. As Willem rode back toward town, Nakai stood beside the irrigation ditch they'd spent the day building, a physical manifestation of what was possible when different peoples worked together toward common goals. Come, brother, he said to Shyla, let's go home. But home felt different that evening. As Nakai prepared dinner, he found himself paying closer attention to the sounds outside his cabin. Shyla seemed to sense the change in his companion's mood, staying closer than usual and checking the perimeter more frequently. The tension broke just after sunset, with the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Sarah Whitmore approached on foot, carrying her 2-year-old daughter Emma in her arms. The child had been born during that terrible winter storm, delivered safely thanks to Nakai's knowledge of healing herbs and his calm presence during the crisis. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, Sarah said, slightly out of breath from the walk. But I heard about the trouble brewing in town, and I wanted to say something. Emma, who had known Shyla since birth, reached out toward the wolf with the fearless curiosity of very young children. Shyla approached carefully and allowed the little girl to touch his fur, his tail wagging gently. See, Emma, that's Shyla, Mama's friend, Sarah said softly. Then looking directly at Nakai, I wanted you to know that not everyone listens to men like Marcus Reed. Some of us remember who was there when we needed help. You don't need to involve yourself in this, Sarah. It could bring trouble to your family. My family's alive because of you, she replied firmly. Both Emma and I would have died that night if you hadn't come through the storm. If people want to condemn you for having a wolf companion, they'll have to explain why they think that matters more than saving lives. As if to emphasize her mother's point, Emma giggled and tugged gently on Shyla's ear. The wolf endured this attention with remarkable patience, occasionally licking the child's fingers with a gentleness that would have shocked those who saw him only as a dangerous predator. You see, Sarah said, Emma knows. Children always know who they can trust. After Sarah and Emma left, Nakai sat on his porch with Shyla beside him, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The silver bracelet on his wrist caught the moonlight, reminding him of all the connections he'd built in this valley. Connections that went far deeper than the fears of ignorant men. We have friends, brother, he said quietly, but we also have enemies we haven't met yet. Shyla pressed closer, his warmth a comfort against the growing chill of the night air. Whatever challenges lay ahead, their bond had proven itself capable of weathering storms both literal and figurative. The question was whether their friends would prove as loyal as their enemies were determined. The hand-drawn map spread across the rough table showed boundaries that existed more in hope than reality. Red lines marked where the territorial government claimed authority, blue lines indicated traditional Apache lands, and black lines showed where various ranchers and settlers had staked claims. The spaces between the lines told the real story, a confusion of overlapping jurisdictions where law meant whatever the strongest man said it meant. Nakai studied the map by lamplight while autumn wind rattled the cabin windows. Shyla lay nearby, but his usual relaxed posture had given way to alert watchfulness. For 3 days, the wolf's behavior had grown increasingly restless, as if he sensed approaching trouble that hadn't yet revealed itself to human perception. The trouble, when it came, arrived in the form of Marcus Reed and 6 armed men. They rode into Nakai's clearing just after dawn, their horses' hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth like an irregular heartbeat. Reed was a tall man with the kind of pale eyes that seemed to look through rather than at whatever they examined. His companions spread out in a loose semicircle, hands resting on weapon grips with practiced casualness. Nakai emerged from his cabin with deliberate calm, Shyla moving to stand beside him. The wolf's hackles weren't raised, but every line of his body spoke of coiled readiness. "Mr. Reed, I presume?" Nakai said politely. "I've heard about your committee. Have you now?" Reed's voice carried the flat tones of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Then you know why we're here. I know what people say, but I'd rather hear it from you." Reed leaned forward in his saddle, studying Shyla with obvious distaste. "That animal is a menace to this community. Wolves kill livestock, threaten children, spread disease. Keeping one as a pet is irresponsible at best, criminal at worst." "Shyla has never harmed any person or animal in this valley," Nakai replied. "Can you say the same about all the humans in your committee?" One of Reed's men, a thick-bodied rancher named Hoskins, spat tobacco juice and growled, "Don't get smart. With us, Indian, we're here to solve a problem, and you can make this easy or hard." Shyla's lips pulled back slightly, revealing the tips of his canine teeth. Not a full snarl, but a clear warning that he'd heard the threat in Hoskins' voice. "Easy," Nakai murmured, though it wasn't clear whether he was speaking to the wolf or the men. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Reed?" "The wolf goes. Today. You can destroy it yourself, or we'll do it for you. But either way, this situation ends now." "No," Nakai said simply. The word hung in the morning air like smoke from a signal fire. Reed's pale eyes narrowed, and his men shifted in their saddles. "You misunderstand," Reed said carefully. "This isn't a negotiation. This is us giving you one chance to do the right thing before we do what needs doing. And you misunderstand." "The nature of partnership," Nakai replied. "Shyla is not my property to dispose of. He is my brother, who chooses to share his life with mine. That choice is his to make, not yours to unmake." Hoskins was reaching for his rifle when Shyla moved. The wolf didn't attack, didn't even growl, but simply flowed from a resting position to a stance that placed him between the mounted men and Nakai. The movement was so fluid and quick that it took the riders a moment to realize what had happened. "Jesus," whispered one of the men. "Look at the size of that thing." Shyla stood perfectly still, but his presence had transformed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. What had been 6 armed men intimidating one unarmed Apache was now something more complex. A pack of predators suddenly uncertain about which of them was actually the prey. Reed's hand moved toward his sidearm, but froze when Shyla's amber gaze fixed on him with laser intensity. The wolf made no aggressive moves, but something in those eyes suggested that drawing a weapon would be a very poor decision. "You're making a mistake," Reed said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "The territorial governor has been informed about this situation. Military authority. The territorial governor is in Santa Fe," Nakai interrupted, "and military authority answers to Washington, where some people still remember my service record. Do you really want to test which of us has more friends in high places?" This was a bluff, but delivered with such quiet confidence that Reed hesitated. In truth, Nakai's connections to his old army colleagues had grown thin over the years, but these men had no way of knowing that. The standoff stretched for several minutes, tension building like pressure in a steam boiler. Then, unexpectedly, it was broken by the arrival of Willem Morrison and 4 other men from town. "Morning, Marcus," Willem called out as he dismounted. "Heard you were planning a visit to Nakai's place. Thought we'd ride along." Reed's expression darkened. "This is official committee business, Morrison. No concern of yours." "Funny thing about that," said James Patterson, the rancher who'd worked alongside Nakai on the irrigation project. "Last I checked, nobody elected your committee to represent this community. We represent the law-abiding citizens who want to live safely," Reed replied. "Safe from what?" asked Carl Brennan. "I've lived here 2 years, and the only trouble I've seen came from men, not wolves." Sarah Whitmore emerged from behind the cottonwoods, carrying young Emma in her arms. Behind her came Maria Santos, Professor Hartwell, and a dozen other Valley residents who had their own reasons for supporting Nakai. "Well now," Willem said with satisfaction, "looks like we've got ourselves a proper town meeting." Reed found himself surrounded by people who weren't interested in his brand of fear-mongering. His committee members began to look distinctly uncomfortable, as they realized the community wasn't united behind their cause. "This isn't over," Reed said finally. "There are laws about dangerous animals, and I intend to see them enforced." "Then you'd better start with the 2-legged variety," Maria Santos replied sharply. "They've caused more trouble in this valley than all the 4-legged ones combined." As Reed and his men rode away, Nakai felt a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. His friends had stood with him today, but Reed didn't seem like a man who accepted defeat gracefully. "Thank you," he said. "To the assembled crowd, all of you." "Don't thank us yet," Willem replied grimly. "Men like Reed don't give up easy. This was just the first round." Schuyler had relaxed visibly as the immediate threat departed, but he remained alert. His wild instincts had served them well today, providing exactly the right amount of intimidation, without crossing the line into actual aggression. That evening, as Nakai and Schuyler settled in for the night, both were acutely aware that their peaceful life had ended. Reed represented forces that wouldn't be satisfied with live and let live solutions. He wanted dominance, control, the imposition of his will on a community that had been learning to thrive through cooperation. "We may need to fight, brother," Nakai said quietly. "Are you ready for that?" Schuyler's answer was to move closer, pressing his shoulder against Nakai's leg in a gesture that had come to mean absolute loyalty. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The ancient Apache war lance had been hidden beneath the floorboards of Nakai's cabin for 5 years, wrapped in oiled cloth and sealed away like a memory too painful to examine. Its shaft was carved from mountain ash and decorated with eagle feathers and bands of silver, symbols of honor earned in battles he'd tried to forget. Now, as he lifted it from its hiding place, the weapon felt both familiar and foreign in his hands. Schuyler watched from across the room, his amber eyes reflecting the lamplight with an intensity that suggested he understood the significance of what he was witnessing. The wolf had been restless for days, pacing the cabin's perimeter and starting at sounds that didn't reach human ears. Whatever was coming, it was close enough for Schuyler to sense it on the wind. The revelation had come 3 hours earlier, delivered by Professor Hartwell in the form of documents that changed everything Nakai thought he knew about Marcus Reed's crusade. "I've been conducting my own investigation," the professor had explained, spreading papers across Nakai's table with shaking hands. "Reed isn't just some concerned settler. He's been buying up land certificates and mineral rights all through the valley, using intermediaries to hide his involvement." The documents painted a picture of calculated deception. Reed had been systematically acquiring property rights throughout the region, often from absent owners who had no idea what their land might be worth. But his plans required clearing out. certain undesirable elements, specifically anyone whose presence might complicate future development schemes. There's more, Hartwell had continued, his academic composure cracking. I found correspondence between Reed and territorial officials. They're planning to declare this entire area a pacification zone to justify military intervention. Your partnership with Shyla is just the excuse they needed. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. Create fear about dangerous Indians with wild animals. Bring in territorial authority to restore order, and in the resulting chaos, complete the land grab that Reed had been orchestrating for months. Nakai's peaceful example of cooperation between cultures had become an obstacle to men who profited from conflict. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. Nakai, Hartwell had said quietly, there's something else. About Shyla. I found military records from the Fort Apache region, reports about wolf packs in the area where you said he was captured. The professor had pulled out a faded military dispatch dated 2 years earlier. A pack of wolves had been living near the sacred springs your people called the place where spirits drink. The pack was led by a female the Apache considered blessed, a descendant of the first wolves, they said. The military wanted them removed because settlers complained about livestock raids. Nakai's blood had turned cold as he read the report. The pack had been hunted systematically, but the alpha female had managed to keep her pups alive for months. Before finally being cornered, she'd fought to the death to protect them, giving the young wolves time to scatter into the wilderness. One pup was captured alive, Hartwell had whispered. The only survivor of a bloodline the Apache considered sacred. Now, holding the war lance that had belonged to his grandfather, Nakai understood the full weight of what fate had placed in his hands. Shyla wasn't just any wolf. He was the last of a sacred line, a living connection to the old ways that Reed's people were trying to destroy. The wolf approached slowly, sniffing the ancient weapon with obvious recognition. His behavior had shifted subtly over the past few days, becoming more formal, more ceremonial. Now Nakai understood why. Shyla had always known what he was, even if his human companion had needed time to learn the truth. So, Nakai said quietly, you are the son of she who drinks starlight. Your mother was the guardian of the sacred springs, and you carry her blood. Shyla's response was to sit perfectly still, while Nakai applied the traditional war paint, red ochre mixed with clay from the sacred springs, patterns that told the story of warriors who had fought to protect their people's sacred places. The wolf submitted to this ritual with a dignity that would have surprised anyone who thought of him merely as a tame animal. As the paint dried on his face, Nakai felt the weight of generations settling on his shoulders. He was no longer just a man trying to live peacefully between two worlds. He was a warrior tasked with protecting something irreplaceable from men who saw everything sacred as an obstacle to profit. The war lance felt lighter now, balanced perfectly, in hands that remembered skills learned in youth and refined through years of conflict. Nakai had tried to leave that part of himself buried with the weapons beneath his floor. But some destinies couldn't be escaped. A sound outside made both man and wolf freeze. Hoofbeats approaching fast, multiple riders pushing their horses hard. Through the darkness, Shyla moved to the window, his hackles finally rising as the immediate threat materialized. Through the glass, Nakai could see torches moving through the trees. Reed hadn't given up after their previous confrontation. He'd simply changed tactics. This time, he was coming at night, with more men and fewer witnesses. Nakai! Reed's voice carried across the clearing, magnified by fury and whiskey. Time's up. Come out and face justice. Justice. The word tasted like ash in Nakai's mouth. These men wouldn't recognize justice if it bit them. They wanted domination, the comfort of knowing that anything different from themselves had been eliminated or controlled. Sheila moved to stand beside him, no longer the curious young wolf who had sat on a trading post table. This was something older, more primal, a guardian spirit made manifest, ready to defend the sacred against those who would defile it. "Are you ready, brother?" Nakai asked, hefting the war lance. "Ready to honor your mother's memory." The wolf's answer was a sound Nakai had never heard before. Not quite a howl, not quite a growl, but something that seemed to carry echoes of every wolf that had ever defended its territory against human encroachment. It was the voice of the wild itself, making its final stand. Outside, Reed's men were spreading out to surround the cabin. They had come prepared for a slaughter, expecting to find a peaceful Apache and his pet wolf. Instead, they were about to face something that existed beyond their understanding. A partnership forged in recognition of the sacred, tempered by mutual respect, and now consecrated by the ancient rituals of war. Nakai opened the cabin door and stepped into the firelight, war paint gleaming on his face and the ancestral lance steady in his grip. Beside him, Shyla moved with the fluid grace of a creature born to hunt and fight. The time for peace had ended. Now came the test that would determine whether the sacred could survive in a world increasingly dominated by the profane. The sacred war paint felt warm against Nakai's skin as he completed the final ritual markings by moonlight. Red ochre and white clay formed patterns that had been old when his grandfather's grandfather first carried a lance into battle, symbols that called upon the spirits of warriors who had died defending their people's sacred places. Each line and circle carried meaning that went deeper than decoration. They were prayers made visible, promises written in pigment and blood. Shyla sat motionless throughout the ceremony, his amber eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed to transcend normal animal awareness. As Nakai worked, the wolf's behavior had grown increasingly formal, as if he too understood that they were preparing for something that would determine the fate of more than just their own lives. "Your mother died protecting the sacred springs," Nakai murmured as he applied the final markings to his forehead. "Tonight, we honor her sacrifice." The wolf's response was a low sound that might have been agreement or perhaps recognition of the gravity of what lay ahead. Outside the cabin, torches moved through the darkness like fallen stars, marking the positions of Reed's men as they completed their encirclement. Nakai had counted at least 12 riders, possibly more. They had come prepared for what they expected to be a simple execution, the elimination of a troublesome Apache and his dangerous pet. Instead, they would face something their limited understanding couldn't encompass. A sacred partnership forged in mutual respect and consecrated by ancient rituals. The war lance stood propped against the cabin wall, its silver bands catching the moonlight that streamed through the windows. Nakai lifted it carefully, feeling the weight of generations in its perfectly balanced shaft. His grandfather had carried this weapon in the wars against the Mexican army. His great-grandfather had wielded it against Apache enemies in the old days before the white men came. Now it would serve again, defending not just territory, but the principle that some bonds were too sacred to be broken by ignorance and greed. "Nakai!" Reed's voice carried across the clearing, thick with whiskey and false authority. "This is your last chance. Come out and surrender that animal, and maybe we can settle this without bloodshed." The lie in those words was obvious to anyone who understood men like Reed. They had come at night in overwhelming numbers, with weapons ready and hatred in their hearts. This was never intended to be a negotiation. It was an execution disguised as law enforcement. Shyla moved to the cabin door, his body language shifting into something Nakai had never seen before. The wolf's usual fluid grace remained, but now it carried undertones of predatory calculation. Every muscle was coiled for action, every sense focused on the threats surrounding their territory. "Be patient, brother," Nakai whispered. "Let them come to us. The cabin gives us advantage. They cannot attack from all sides at once." But even as he spoke, Nakai knew that superior numbers and the element of surprise gave Reed's men significant advantages. The outcome of the coming battle would depend not on force alone, but on the spiritual strength of their partnership and the wisdom earned through years of mutual trust. A rifle shot cracked through the night air, the bullet splintering wood inches. From the cabin's main window, the time for words had ended. "Light it up," Reed shouted, and suddenly the clearing blazed with gunfire. Nakai dropped to the floor as bullets shattered windows and punched holes through the cabin walls. Schuyler had already found cover behind the stone fireplace, his wild instincts serving them both well in the chaos of sudden violence. The attack was coordinated but clumsy, the work of men who had planned their approach but lacked real combat experience. They were firing at shadows, wasting ammunition on a building they couldn't see into clearly. Their torches, meant to provide illumination, instead ruined their night vision and marked their positions for anyone with the skill to exploit such advantages. Nakai had learned warfare in a harder school than these men could imagine. Years of fighting Apache enemies who moved like ghosts through impossible terrain had taught him lessons that no amount of whiskey courage could overcome. He waited through the initial barrage, counting muzzle flashes and noting the rhythm of reloading. When the firing slackened, he moved to the shattered window and sent his first shot into the darkness. The cry of pain that followed told him he'd found his mark. "He's shooting back," someone yelled unnecessarily. "Burn him out," Reed commanded. "Torch the whole place." Nakai had expected this. The cabin represented everything these men wanted to destroy, a symbol of successful cooperation between Apache wisdom and settler determination. They would rather see it burned than allow it to continue serving as an example of what was possible when fear gave way to understanding. But Schuyler had been prepared for fire as well as bullets. While Nakai engaged the attackers from the windows, the wolf slipped out through a hole they'd previously cut in the cabin's back wall, an escape route that appeared to be simple damage from the gunfire. What followed was something Reed's men had never experienced and couldn't have prepared for, being hunted by a creature that understood both their tactics and their limitations. The first scream came from the eastern perimeter, where one of Reed's men had been stationed to prevent escape in that direction. It was followed by shouts of confusion and terror, as the remaining attackers realized they were no longer the only predators in the darkness. Schuyler moved through the night like a shadow given substance, using terrain and timing to turn hunters into prey. He didn't kill. That wasn't his purpose. But he created chaos and fear among men who had expected easy victory over a single opponent. "Where is it?" someone yelled. "Where's the damned wolf?" "Behind you." "No, over there. I can't see anything." The careful coordination of Reed's attack began to dissolve into panic as his men found themselves fighting an enemy they couldn't locate or predict. Some fired at shadows, others at each other, and all the while Schuyler continued his deadly dance through the darkness. Nakai used the confusion to his advantage, moving from window to window and picking off targets with the precision of a man who had learned to make every shot count. Each bullet found its mark, not to kill but to wound and demoralize, removing threats while preserving the possibility of future peace. "Fall back!" Reed finally shouted. "Regroup at the tree line!" But falling back proved more difficult than advancing had been. Schuyler harried their retreat, appearing and disappearing like a supernatural force that couldn't be fought with conventional weapons. As dawn approached, Reed found himself with half his original force, facing an enemy who had turned his overwhelming advantage into a liability. The Apache and his wolf had transformed their cabin into a fortress and the surrounding wilderness into an ally. The real battle was just beginning. The eagle feather drifted down through the morning light like a blessing made visible, coming to rest at Nakai's feet just as Reed's men launched their final assault. Schuyler had flanked around to the left, using the terrain with an intelligence that would have impressed any military strategist. The wolf understood instinctively that their enemy's greatest weakness was their inability to coordinate under pressure. By attacking from multiple directions, he and Nakai could force Reed's men to choose between targets, ensuring that someone would always be exposed. The second position fell with even less resistance. The man stationed behind a granite boulder saw Shyla approaching from one side and Nakai from the other, and simply threw down his weapons without being asked. The mathematical reality of the situation had penetrated his terror. 2 against 1 was impossible odds when the two moved with perfect coordination. "This is madness," Reed yelled, firing wildly in Nakai's direction. "Stand and fight like men." But his remaining companions were already breaking. One man ran for his horse, abandoning weapons and dignity in his haste to escape. Another called out his surrender from behind a deadfall where he'd taken cover. Reed found himself alone, facing an Apache warrior and a wolf who had systematically dismantled his superior force through tactics he couldn't understand and courage he couldn't match. "You've won," Reed said, his voice cracking with strain. "What do you want?" Nakai approached. Slowly, the warlance held with ceremonial precision. Behind him, Shyla moved with the patient, stalking gait of a predator, absolutely certain of its prey. "I want you to understand something," Nakai replied, his painted face impassive. "You came here to destroy what you feared, but you never bothered to learn what you were destroying." The eagle feather in his hair caught the breeze, reminding everyone present that this victory belonged not just to man and wolf, but to forces older and more enduring than human ambition. Reed's hand moved toward his sidearm, desperation overriding judgment. But before the weapon cleared its holster, Shyla was there, not attacking but simply present, amber eyes fixed on Reed's face with an intensity that froze the man's blood. For a long moment, predator and prey regarded each other across a gulf of understanding that could never be bridged. Reed saw his own death reflected in those ancient eyes and knew with absolute certainty that his life continued only because the wolf chose mercy over justice. The bonds we forge through respect are stronger than those created through fear. Nakai said quietly, "That is the lesson you needed to learn. The question now is whether you're wise enough to remember it." He retrieved it from somewhere in the darkness, a sign that the spirits of the ancient warriors were watching, approving of this fight to preserve what was sacred. Nakai tucked the feather into his hair as bullets whined overhead. The cabin's walls were pocked with holes, but the stone fireplace and thick timber construction had provided adequate protection through the long night. Now, as the sun climbed above the eastern mountains, Reed was making his desperate gambit to end this, before word spread to the territorial authorities who might ask uncomfortable questions. "This ends now," Reed shouted from behind an overturned wagon he'd positioned as cover. "Burn the whole place down." 2 of his remaining men ran forward carrying torches and coal oil, intending to set the cabin ablaze and force its defenders into the open. They had not counted on Shyla's tactical intelligence. The wolf materialized from behind a boulder, as if conjured by the morning mist, moving with the fluid precision of a creature born to hunt. He struck the first man low, sending him tumbling and scattering burning oil across the ground, where it ignited harmlessly. The second man got off one wild shot before Shyla's weight knocked him backward, the torch spinning away to land in a patch of damp earth. Neither man was seriously injured, but both were effectively removed from the fight, crawling away from the wolf with the wide-eyed terror of men who had just realized they were not the apex predators they'd believed themselves to be. "Incredible," Reed breathed, watching his carefully planned attack dissolve into chaos. How? Does it know? How does it anticipate? Nakai could have told him that partnership created understanding that went beyond normal communication. He and Shyla had learned to think as one unit, each anticipating the other's movements and intentions. What Reed saw as supernatural was simply the result of perfect trust and countless hours of shared experience. The war lance felt alive in Nakai's hands as he stepped through the cabin's shattered doorway. The morning light caught the silver bands and eagle feathers, transforming the ancient weapon into something that seemed to burn with inner fire. He moved with the fluid grace that years of warfare had burned into muscle memory, each step calculated to maximize advantage while minimizing exposure. Shyla appeared at his side as if summoned, the wolf's amber eyes bright with intelligence and purpose. Together, they advanced across the clearing, no longer defending but attacking, taking the fight to men who had expected easy victory over a passive opponent. Reed's remaining forces, 4 men plus their leader, had taken cover behind trees and boulders at the clearing's edge. They possessed superior firepower, but their leader's wild-eyed panic was spreading through the group like a disease. These were settlers and drifters, not soldiers, and the prolonged battle had tested their resolve beyond its limits. "He's just one man," Reed screamed, trying to rally his forces. "One Indian with a wolf. We outnumber them." But numbers meant nothing when fear dominated thinking. Reed's men were shooting at shadows, wasting ammunition on targets they couldn't clearly see. Their coordination had collapsed under the pressure of fighting an enemy who moved like smoke and struck like lightning. Nakai reached the first position, a cottonwood tree that provided excellent cover but poor escape routes. The man behind it was reloading frantically, his hands shaking as he tried to ram powder and shot into his rifle barrel. "Drop the weapon," Nakai said quietly, the lance point steady at the man's throat. The settler looked up into painted features that seemed carved from stone and amber eyes that promised swift death if he chose poorly. His rifle clattered to the ground. "Smart," Nakai said, then bound the man's hands with rawhide cord before moving on to the next position. The broken chain lay scattered in the morning grass, its iron links shattered by forces that metal could never contain. Reed stared at the remnants of what had once bound Shyla during his capture, now reduced to rust-stained fragments that told the story of a spirit that could never truly be caged. "You think you've won something," Reed said, his voice hollow with defeat. "But there are more like me, men who won't tolerate this abomination you call partnership." Nakai stood perfectly still, the war lance grounded beside him like a staff of office. Behind him, Shyla had positioned himself where he could watch both Reed and the approaches to their territory. The wolf's alertness had not diminished with victory. If anything, he seemed more focused now, as if sensing that the greatest test still lay ahead. "Perhaps," Nakai replied calmly, "but each man must choose for himself whether to walk in fear or understanding." Reed's hand inched toward his fallen weapon, desperation overriding the lessons that should have been learned from his defeat. But as his fingers closed around the pistol grip, Shyla moved, not with the explosive violence of an attack, but with the fluid certainty of absolute commitment. The wolf placed himself directly between Reed and Nakai, his body language conveying a message clearer than words. To reach the man, the weapon would first have to go through him. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, time seemed suspended. Reed's finger found the trigger, his face twisted with the rage of a man whose worldview was crumbling around him. Nakai remained motionless, trusting completely in his partner's judgment and ability. Then Shyla did something that would be remembered, long after the grass had grown over the scattered chain links. Instead of attacking or retreating, he sat down. The gesture was so unexpected, so completely contrary to what Reed had anticipated, that the man's finger froze on the trigger. Here was a wolf, a creature he'd been taught to fear as the embodiment of savage wildness, choosing calm dignity over violence. "I don't understand," Reed whispered, his weapon wavering in his uncertain grip. "That," said Nakai gently, "is the beginning of wisdom." Shyla remained seated, his amber eyes fixed on Reed's face with an expression that somehow managed to convey both strength and compassion. The wolf had learned through his partnership with Nakai that true power lay not in the ability to destroy, but in the choice of when to exercise restraint. Reed's weapon clattered to the ground as his hand began to shake. "What are you?" he asked, his voice breaking. "We are what happens when fear gives way to trust," Nakai replied, "when strength chooses service over domination, when different beings recognize the sacred in each other. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the moment. Willem Morrison appeared at the edge of the clearing, followed by Sarah Whitmore, Professor Hartwell, and a dozen other valley residents who had heard the gunfire and come to help their neighbors. "Looks like we missed the excitement," Willem said, taking in the scene of scattered weapons and defeated attackers. "Not entirely," Nakai replied, his gaze still fixed on Reed. "The most important part is just beginning." Sarah Whitmore approached, carefully her young daughter Emma riding in her arms. The little girl's eyes went immediately to Shyla, and she reached out with the fearless curiosity of a child who had never been taught that wolves were monsters. "Doggy," Emma said happily, struggling to reach the wolf from her mother's arms. Shyla rose from his sitting position and approached slowly, allowing the child to touch his fur with gentle fingers. The contrast was stark. A creature that had just faced down armed men, now submitting patiently to the attention of a toddler who saw only a friend. Reed watched this interaction with growing amazement. "How?" he asked weakly. "How is this possible? Children. See what adults forget," Maria Santos said, having arrived with the others. "They see hearts instead of appearances, intentions instead of assumptions." Professor Hartwell had been documenting the scene in his notebook, but now he closed it with a snap. "Mr. Reed," he said formally, "I believe you owe this community an apology and an explanation." The broken man who had led the attack looked nothing like the confident agitator who had stirred up fears just days before. The truth of what he had witnessed, the partnership between Nakai and Shyla, the wolf's choice of mercy over vengeance, the child's innocent acceptance, had shattered his certainties as completely as the iron chain that lay scattered in the grass. "I was wrong," Reed said finally, the words barely audible, "about everything." Nakai stepped forward, extending his hand to the fallen man. "Being wrong is not a crime," he said quietly. "Refusing to learn from being wrong, that is where true failure lies." Reed stared at the offered hand for a long moment, then slowly reached out to accept it. As Nakai helped him to his feet, Shyla approached and sniffed the man who had tried to destroy him, then did something remarkable. He briefly touched Reed's hand with his nose before stepping back. Forgiveness offered by a creature that had every reason to seek revenge. The broken chain would rust away with the seasons, but the bonds forged in that moment would prove far more durable than iron. The memorial stone stood where the great battle had taken place, its surface carved with symbols that told a story bridges could span the deepest chasms of understanding. Apache spirals intertwined with settler roses, while at the center, a wolf and a man stood side by side beneath a sun that belonged to no single people, but shone equally on all. 20 years had passed since that morning, when fear had given way to wisdom, and the valley had become something unprecedented in the territories, a place where different peoples lived, not just in peace, but in genuine partnership. The irrigation systems that watered their fields combined Apache knowledge of the land with settler determination. Their children grew up speaking multiple languages and honoring multiple traditions. Their successes were shared, their burdens carried together. Nakai, now weathered by 6 decades of life, sat in the afternoon shade beside the memorial with Shyla resting at his feet. The wolf had grown old gracefully, his muzzle now white with age, his movements deliberate rather than fluid. But his eyes remained bright with intelligence, and his devotion to his human partner had never wavered. "Tell us the story again, grandfather." "Nakai," said Emma Whitmore, now 22 and a teacher in the valley's school. She sat with a group of children whose faces reflected the mixed heritage of a community that had learned to see diversity as strength rather than threat. Nakai smiled, the expression transforming his lined features. "Which story would you like to hear? The one about the trading post, the night of the great battle, or perhaps the tale of how your valley learned that the greatest courage lies not in fighting, but in choosing when not to fight. All of them, said young Miguel Santos, Maria's grandson, start from the very beginning. As Nakai began the familiar tale, his voice carried the measured cadence of a man who understood that stories were more than entertainment. They were the vessels that carried wisdom from one generation to the next. He spoke of a time when fear ruled men's hearts and difference was seen as danger. He told of a wolf pup sitting on a wooden table, waiting for someone to recognize his worth. He described the patient building of trust between species that had been taught to fear each other. The children listened with the rapt attention they gave only to stories that resonated in their souls. These young people had grown up in a world where cooperation was normal, where Apache wisdom and settler innovation combined to create prosperity that neither could have achieved alone. To them, the idea of fighting over differences seemed as strange as their grandparents once found the notion of partnership. But why did the bad men want to hurt Shyla? Asked little Thomas Reed, the grandson of the man who had once led the attack on this very ground. Marcus Reed had lived to see his fears proven wrong, eventually becoming one of the Valley's most ardent advocates for the cooperative community his ignorance had nearly destroyed. Fear, Nakai replied simply. They feared what they didn't understand, and instead of seeking understanding, they chose to destroy what frightened them. Shyla raised his head at the mention of his name, amber eyes still bright despite his advanced age. The wolf had become legendary throughout the territories, not as a dangerous beast, but as proof that the bonds between thinking beings could transcend the boundaries that society tried to impose. "Will you tell us about the chain?" Emma asked. "About how Shyla broke free?" Nakai's hand moved to rest gently on the wolf's grizzled head. "Shyla was never truly chained," he said. "Metal links can bind the body, but they cannot hold a spirit that chooses freedom. The real chains were the ones in men's minds, the ideas that told them wolves and humans could never be partners, that Apache and settler could never be neighbors, that different ways of living could never strengthen each other. As the afternoon wore on, the children gradually dispersed to their various homes and duties, but Emma remained. She had been working on a book about the valley's history, interviewing the elders who remembered the old times of conflict and separation. "Uncle Nakai," she said softly, using the honorary title the entire community had adopted for him. "People say that you and Shyla changed everything, that without your example, none of this would exist." Nakai shook his head slowly. "We were simply two beings who chose to trust each other. The change came from everyone who decided that our example was worth following. You cannot build a community with just one partnership. It takes many people making the same choice, day after day, year after year." The sun was setting behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Shyla struggled to his feet, his age showing in the careful way he moved, but his dignity intact. Together, man and wolf walked slowly toward the cabin that had become the heart of a legend. "How much longer?" Emma asked gently, watching Shyla's labored gait. "Not long now," Nakai replied, "but he has lived well, and he has seen his legacy secure. What more can any of us ask?" As they reached the cabin, Shyla settled carefully onto the worn blanket that still bore the patterns his grandmother had woven so many years ago. Nakai sat beside him, his weathered hand resting on the wolf's shoulder. The memorial stone caught the last rays of sunlight, its carved symbols seeming to glow with inner fire. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose understanding over fear, cooperation over conflict. But tonight, an old man and an old wolf rested together in the peace they had helped to create. In the growing darkness, children's laughter echoed from the houses scattered throughout the valley, the sound of a generation that had never known, a world where differences were seen as threats rather than gifts. It was the music of their legacy, the proof that two unlikely partners had indeed changed everything by simply choosing to trust. The bonds they had forged would outlive them both, strong as stone and enduring as the mountains themselves.